I recently read an article in Tempest Magazine online about the national elections in Mexico. When the government run by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, better known as AMLO, was replaced by Claudia Sheinbaum. They are both of the Morena party in Mexico, and both see themselves as part of a couple of hundred years radical tradition of reform in Mexican politics. Thanks for joining me today in Facing Reality for Social Justice as we talk about Mexican politics. The Tempest article was written by Hector Rivera, and he does an excellent job of describing the background of the Morena Party and its perspective for Mexico's future and the difficulties the country faces going forward. Hector Rivera describes himself as a queer Chicano geographer whose writings have appeared in Spectre Journal and Tempest Magazine. He is a socialist activist and educator based in Los Angeles. The article, Claudia Sheinbaum and Mexico's New Regime in Formation, appeared in the July 21st, 2024 edition of the online magazine, which you can read at tempestmag.org. After the conversation with Hector, stick around for a song dedicated to a hero of the 1910-1920 Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa. This will be sung by Amparo Ochoa. Let's go to our conversation now with Hector. Okay, Hector, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it's an important discussion that we talk about what's happening next door to us in Mexico. It's so important for the economy, for transfer of people, if you will, migration of people, for culture, and people in this country, no matter what, if they're from Mexico or Mexican-American, they pay attention to what's happening in their home or mother country, however you want to put it. It's an important event that just happened that I think deserves some discussion and see where we can go with this. And I'd like to start by asking you, it's a tradition, or there's a tradition in Mexico lately, over the past a number of years, of a populist discussion or movement, whatever that means, that's what I'd like to get into, with the former president of Mexico, Obrador, and some of the policies that he has incorporated in his programs over the years. And the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, seems to be consistent and sort of part of that tradition. And so what I'd like to do is ask, if you don't mind, if you could talk a little bit about Obrador's policies, his politics, his thoughts about Mexico, and then maybe we can look at Claudia Sheinbaum's differences or similarities to what he was doing to see where we can go with that, and see where we go down the road, see what kind of a discussion we can have. So if you could start with that, that would be helpful.
Sure, Wayne. Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast, Facing Reality for Social Justice. I was very happy to get your invitation. As you know, I write on Mexican politics, and I recently wrote an article for Tempest Magazine about the election of Claudia Sheinbaum as Mexico's new president. So this is a very exciting time in Mexican politics. And she is part of the political party known as Morena, the Movement for National Regeneration, a political party that was started after 2006 by several figures from the left in Mexico. We can, a broad left in Mexico. In fact, Claudia Sheinbaum, the newly elected president, was one of the people that helped Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO. She was one of the people that helped him found that political party, Morena. In my article, I described Morena as a sort of center-left formation. It definitely has a lot of influences from social movements in the Mexican left. However, one of my criticisms is that as the party has entered power, it has lost those connections, which to begin with were not the strongest social movement connections. Nevertheless, it does have a large popular backing, as you say, and we could categorize AMLO as a populist president. I would say definitely he's more of a centrist figure, center-left tinges. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador comes from the state of Tabasco in south east Mexico, a state that is very rich in terms of its oil production, but also very marginalized, as much of the southeast of Mexico has historically been marginalized by the central government. There is a relationship of extraction and abandonment of the indigenous populations. And that has definitely marked AMLO's worldview. When he got involved in politics, it was over land issues, issues of discrimination. And over time, AMLO was also a militant of the Party of the Institutional Revolution, the PRI, where Mexico had a 70-year period of that one-party state. So if you ever wanted to go into politics, you really have to start in the PRI, because the other alternative, the PAN, the the National Action Party, is a more of a Catholic, right-wing, social democratic, Christian, social Christian party. In any case, through his involvement in politics, large sectors of the Mexican left decide to launch their own political party in the late 1980s because they believe that the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, is corrupt and moving in a neoliberal direction. And so they launch a new political party known as the PRD, the Party for the Democratic Revolution. In any case, I mentioned this to say that AMLO comes from a long history of social movements and a struggle to push for a democratic opening in Mexican politics. So there is a strong core of a democratic character to his politics, but also, as I mentioned in my article, centrist and populist. There's some contradictions in the movement of Morena and the new government. If for now, for example, I'll talk about some of the policies that he has implemented as government of Mexico, which have been many. There's definitely an improvement in the reduction of poverty. AMLO has reduced poverty through his social programs and macroeconomic management to levels that we hadn't seen in 17 years, before the pandemic even. AMLO's government has also instituted minimum wage increases every year. And that is something that we had not seen in 30 or 40 years in Mexican politics, or nothing substantial, unlike what AMLO and his government have been doing. His political program also involves a redistribution of the spending power of the state through social programs, which we could call welfare programs or stipend programs, especially to low-income families, children in elementary, middle school, and high school. Working mothers and seniors also receive pensions, not necessarily large sums, but definitely sums that make a difference for people. And these are programs that in the past had only existed in a limited manner, but programs that AMLO and his governments, whether it was when he was the mayor of Mexico City or now that he is president, these social programs have now become institutionalized as part of the aid that people receive from the government.
Well, one of the things that you say in your article, which I thought was quite interesting, is that what he did is to call his program direction the fourth transformation. In a sense, he put this within the history of Mexico, which is a very good thing to do, I guess. And the 4T program. And this is not just a short history over the past couple of decades. He takes it back to 1810 as an example of what he is imagining for what he's trying to do. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting in your article was giving the specifics of the ones that you just mentioned, including construction projects, jobs, infrastructure, many things that people want, need, and they're obviously very important for the economy. One of the things, though, you also talk about is that the program does what makes the capitalist market more efficient. The markets, the industry, the structures there, the roads, the infrastructure that you need for an efficient economy is not what fits within that 4T, if you will, within the traditions of Mexico. And it's more of an efficiency move rather than a radical transformation of society. And could you talk a bit about that division there, about the reality of what he's doing versus the vision of what he's trying to say?
Thank you, Wayne. That's a really important question, and I think something to differentiate. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador sees himself in line with the progressive movements in Mexican history, and he calls his presidency and the movement that he has started the fourth transformation. This as a way to refer to what he calls the three previous historic transformations in Mexico. The first was independence from Spain from 1810 to 1820. The second was a series of battles between liberals and conservatives in 19th century Mexico, where the liberals won, and they kicked out empires and the power of the church from government. The third great transformation is the Mexican Revolution, which was led by peasant leaders and populist leaders, as well as industrial workers who fought for the 8-hour day, indigenous rights, redistribution of land, etc. So AMLO uses the terminology of the fourth transformation to tap into the ideals of those previous movements. One of my criticisms, though, is that those transformations were deep in terms of how they changed society. And those transformations were deep because they involved millions of people taking change for themselves, right? Getting involved in the process of social change. AMLO argues that his fourth transformation is in line with those movements, with the difference that it is not a violent uprising, like the Mexican Revolution was, for example. And he argues that the process that he has led is one of a revolution of consciousness, which is a very, I think, interesting discursive argument that he's making, that we can revolutionize consciousness by tapping into people's democratic ambitions. And in some ways, I think he has been able to do that. Mexicans were tired of the previous governments. And the country, by 2018, the country had been engulfed in several social crises and turmoil. So AMLO's election to power in 2018 was in part due to people being so tired of the corruption of the previous governments. The previous 20 years, for example, those governments had launched the war on drugs, which has been quite violent. And so AMLO sees himself inaugurating a new period in Mexican history, one in which the government is now on the side of the people, once again, in a sense, returning to its rightful place, right? A state that manages the infrastructure and the state entities on behalf of the taxpayer, on behalf of the citizenry. Part of what AMLO sees, though, is that in order for Mexico to be able to provide for the population, Mexico needs to have a friendly business climate. And in order to do that, Mexico needs to upgrade its infrastructure through a nationalized framework, because AMLO is also a big critic of the new liberal policies that dismantled large sectors of Mexican industry and infrastructure in the 1990s, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was instituted, and before that. And so AMLO has introduced large mega project construction, for example, a large refinery in Dos Bocas, Tabasco, a very large network of railroads known as the Mayan Train in the Yucatan Peninsula, and also new solar energy power plants, roads, airports, and many other large mega projects. And so he's trying to set up Mexico to create a very friendly business climate where Mexico can become, in a sense, replace China in some ways as a factory of the world, especially as Mexico is seen as a safer investment option compared to China, as we begin to talk about the decoupling of the Chinese and American economies. So AMLO is trying to place Mexico in the best position economically to take advantage of this larger conflict between the U.S. and Mexico.
And with the new president, with Sheinbaum coming into a position as president of the country, she sees herself, for what you're saying, and I assume was from what she's saying, as part of that tradition, or part of that idea of the fourth transformation. And let me ask specifically, does she see herself as part of the fourth transformation direction that's been going on? And what's the similarity or difference with how she looks at her position versus what she's taking over as president of Mexico?
I think it's, we can clearly see the continuity between AMLO and Sheinbaum. However, Claudia Sheinbaum has her own political formation and priorities because she's also a scientist, an energy engineer. So she's going to bring in some of those shifts. However, for the most part, Claudia Sheinbaum sees herself as part of the same project of this fourth transformation. Her argument is that she's going to build the second floor of this project, right? AMLO set up the foundations in the first floor. Now her turn is to keep on building on that, expanding, for example, passenger railroad construction, which is very important and sorely needed in Mexico as an alternative to car mobility and dependency on bus companies. But she's also going to put her own imprint in terms of her role in energy science. For example, she co-authored in 2007 a chapter on energy for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that report won a Nobel Prize. So she has been an advocate for renewables and also to try to bring more efficiency into the energy grid. But for example, in the last 6 years, Claudia Sheinbaum was the governor of Mexico City, the chief of government, the mayor of Mexico City, if you will. And she created one of the largest solar power plants in Latin America in Mexico City. And she's also looking into biofuels as well as electric batteries manufacturing within Mexico City. So she's going to bring her own stamp. Claudia Sheinbaum also comes from the historic Mexican left. Her father was part of the Communist Party of Mexico, for example. Claudia Sheinbaum participated in social movements at the National Autonomous University, defending public education. And later on, she entered into the academy, where, again, she had a very successful role in publishing and the academy, but she has always been connected to political movements. And like I said, she also helped found Morena with AMLO. And later on, she was the mayor of Tlalpan, a jurisdiction south of Mexico City as well. And so she has been involved in politics, but also in energy research. And so she's going to bring in that. Now, I do want to mention, what I hope is an important difference. During AMLO's presidency, the feminist movement was one of the only social movements that didn't support AMLO wholeheartedly, right? The feminist movement remained independent and did not necessarily support his candidacy. During AMLO's presidency, he was very critical of the women's movement, often mocking them, arguing that if they were critical of the government, they were on the side of the opposition, of the right-wing opposition, among many other instances of him publicly marginalizing the women's movement. And so Claudia Sheinbaum, part of her candidacy, also argued that this new opening was also the time for women to take a political lead, to move to the center of politics. Nevertheless, it remains to be seen if she really tackles the issues of gender violence in Mexico, the disappearance and kidnapping and rape of women, for example, remains a huge problem that has not has not stopped under the current government. And so Claudia Sheinbaum, I think, will have her work cut out to bring the feminist, women's movement genuinely into the government, into their policy, because the previous government, I think, was not able to do that, was not interested in doing that, and I think that could be a new opening for this movement to actually get its positions heard. However, we will see, even though Claudia Sheinbaum does come from an activist, academic, political background, at the same time, she is part of this national leadership, and her circles of power are many people who have different interests, who come from different backgrounds as well, right? And so her challenge, the challenge of Claudia Sheinbaum, will be to maintain the coalition that AMLO built over the last 10, 15 years, to maintain that coalition, to be able to govern successfully and also deliver for the working class voters that elected her.
When you talk about her work within the energy sector, could you dive a little bit deeper into that, in the sense that is it a government industry, or is it private, public ownership, that kind of thing? And also, how does it fit within many of the kinds of things that are going on internationally with energy, to try to see if there's some kind of a movement away from gas and oil, which is difficult to do in Mexico, I think. It's such a big part of the economy, and moving in a direction similar to what you have in some places, moving in nuclear possibly, or what's her position on that as an academic, both as an academic and now how she's going to try to implement that as president?
Correct. I think you point out something really well here, right? That is what I'm referring to in my article, are these contradictions in the new government. On the one hand, Claudia Sheinbaum is an energy scientist. She knows the importance of tackling climate change, of shifting towards renewable energies. But I think she's being very pragmatic, because at the end of the day, the Mexican economy depends, the national budget depends on oil. Mexico is an oil-producing country. It has definitely gone down in terms of its. I think it might not be in the top 20, but it's still an oil producer. What AMLO did was to revitalize the nationalized oil energy sector, both the nationalized company Pemex, Mexican Oil, Petróleos Mexicanos, but also the National Electricity Commission, right, which handles hydroelectric power plants, solar power plants, wind turbines, etc. So AMLO's program, this fourth transformation, their project is to turn the infrastructure of the state broadly towards the development of the country. And that is going to involve, in the eyes of AMLO, right, it has to involve recovering the oil sector. And so this puts us in a contradiction, because we know the dangers of climate change. We know that it's upon us, that we are in a climate emergency. And so Mexico is in a way trying to have its cake and eat it too, when you continually build refineries, revamp existing oil infrastructure to produce more oil more cheaply. But at the same time, Mexico is also trying to move into renewables like solar, wind, and hydroelectric power plants. So those are some of the tensions in the program. How aggressive Sheinbaum is pushing for a renewable transition.
No, she comes from an academic position that got a Nobel Prize, moving into an economy that's based on oil. That is a contradiction, but it's not just a contradiction within Mexico. It's obviously a contradiction internationally. Then let's move a little bit to another issue that I think obviously is of great importance to Mexico, and especially being close to the U.S., which is migration. Can you give us some background on what you feel is the position of the Mexican government under her administration for what is going on now at the Mexico-U.S. border? Is she going to separate herself in her position from what AMLO had, or does she have a different direction she wants to go in?
Well, the current government broadly identifies itself with the values and principles of what AMLO and Sheinbaum call Mexican humanism. Mexican humanism is a set of ideas that tries to tap into Mexico's historic leftist, social justice, humanist values. One of those humanist values, for example, is political asylum. Mexico is a country that offers and respects political asylum. Mexico also has a non-interventionist foreign policy. When it comes to immigration, AMLO has tried to welcome refugees with some policies, for example, temporary work programs, some support from the Mexican Immigration Agency. At the same time, though, we have to understand that Mexico is highly dependent on the United States, and so what has happened in practice is quite different. For example, under Donald Trump, who had a much more aggressive immigration policy of closing the border, Mexico became a third country of sorts, or was basically a country that had to handle and somehow manage refugees and migrants as they were making their way to the United States. On paper, Mexico does not have to do that, and believes that AMLO believed that it was not Mexico's problem to handle the refugees migrating to the United States. However, the United States, through several threats under Trump and later to a certain extent under Biden, Mexico basically had to help the U.S. manage the groups of migrants trying to cross into the U.S. How did Mexico do that? Well, Mexico was forced to use the newly created National Guard to limit migration in the Guatemalan border. And so now what has happened is that immigrants and refugees coming to the U.S. don't just have to deal with U.S. authorities, but also the National Guard is trying to intercept them as they cross the border with Guatemala and southern Mexico, right? And so I think that it really depends. We'll see what happens with the U.S. elections. But if Trump is elected, that will effectively force Mexico to be another immigration entity on behalf of the United States. That's broadly the policy, right? That Mexico also has to do the bidding of the United States to contain migration. Well, AMLO does have a broader vision. I'll give him, credit where credit is due. AMLO argues that if the U.S. genuinely wants to stop refugee migrations, etc., that the U.S., Mexico, and the more developed Canada as well need to invest in Central America. AMLO argues that the way to deal with the refugee crisis is to invest in Central America, to invest in agriculture and other subsidy programs, development programs to genuinely tackle the roots that are causing these refugees to move. Nevertheless, in practice, as I argue in my article, Mexico has just, the National Guard is used as another immigration police that's getting in the way of migrants safely crossing to the United States.
When you mentioned previously that Sheinbaum was part of a feminist movement, or saw an advantage of being in relationship to that movement. Well, let me talk about the movements instead of talking about her. How do the movements see her and her positions, both the feminist movement, the labor movement, indigenous movement? There's so many questions. Maybe we don't have much time to talk about it today. Maybe we could do it another time. But if you could briefly go over what is that relationship? Because as people get into politics, get into government, it's not the same thing as being in the streets or necessarily being part of organizations that are in protest. So there's a different dynamic there. How's that playing out now, do you think?
Yes, I think that it's the picture in Mexico when it comes to social movements, we have a mixed bag. On the one hand, many movements and leaderships of those movements identified AMLO as a progressive figure to support and put in power, right? So some of those social movements became directly involved in getting Morena and AMLO and Sheinbaum to power. At the same time, however, there are other movements that have an ambivalent relationship, and then there are some that have been excluded. So, for example, within the labor movement, some unions are in strong support of AMLO. For example, the miners' union. The miners' union supports a political party known as the Party of Work, the Partido del Trabajo, or generally you say the Party of Labor. And that party is in coalition with AMLO's Morena party, right? So the miners are in that position. Nevertheless, you could argue that the miners' union is not the most democratic, and it follows what the leadership wants. And so the leadership sees here a negotiating position to be supporting the party in power. Then you also have the teachers' union, the CNTE. The CNTE has historically been more combative, more democratic, and leftist as well. The CMT has really strong bastions in the states of Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, Michoacan, states that have a long history of social movement and indigenous activism. And so AMLO has tried to court the teachers' union, the CNTE, by pushing away the privatization of education and by putting in more resources into the education budget. Nevertheless, the teachers' union, for example, was protesting even the day of the election when Claudia Sheinbaum won on June 2nd. The teachers' union had an occupation, a small occupation in downtown Mexico City, demanding a salary increase because education, teaching is still highly underfunded, especially in rural schools. The salaries are very low. It's impossible to live on some of these salaries. And then you have other unions that AMLO, for example, had historically marginalized. This is a very a small scenario, but it gives you a larger picture of how AMLO works. For example, the electricians union, the SME, is a small radical electricians union based in Mexico City in central Mexico. That union had been fighting privatization since 2006 or thereabouts. Nevertheless, because that union didn't support AMLO in 2018, AMLO didn't help resolve their grievances. The union then realized that they had to support Claudia Sheinbaum, and they did for this election, and now Sheinbaum, they hope, is going to help resolve those problems, right? And so AMLO could also be not the biggest friend of labor. And I'll just say this in terms of labor and movements. AMLO's government, while there have been considerable changes in terms of the minimum wage and social programs and the reduction of poverty, AMLO's government doesn't necessarily side with workers. More or less, it tries to move out of the way. For example, Mexican workers can now join independent labor unions because the current unions are more of like business unions and very corrupt. And so Mexican workers can now try to get an independent union, but the bureaucracy and the paperwork is still on the side of the employer and the corrupt unions. Okay, so there's those ambivalences. When it comes to the women's movement, I think that it's important that the movements remain independent because they have a bigger opportunity of making demands from that independence. For example, the women's movement has not been entirely co-opted by AMLO and Sheinbaum. Nevertheless, Sheinbaum has brought some a kind of a women's point of view, she says. For example, women who work in the home will now receive a pension after 60 years of age. So that is reducing the pension age about 4 years, so that women who work in the home can get a pension sooner as well. And so there are some of these shifts happening. There's, you can talk about the institutionalized women's movement that is in NGOs and government entities, and then you can talk about the more radical women's movement that is in the streets, which remains independent of Morena. And then maybe we can talk about it more later, but you also have indigenous movements and environmental movements that are independent, but mostly marginalized.
Well, it's a lot to talk about, and I'd like at some point to go through, maybe in another conversation, some of those movements. And that's so important to what's going on, especially if the recession that everybody is talking about comes down the road. Economic turmoil can change things very quickly. And that can also, an opening, if not an opening for success, it's an opening for an opportunity to give a different point of view in the sense of what's going on. Overall, with the transition, from what you're saying, you seem to be saying that she is, as the new president, is within the tradition set up previously by Moreno and by AMLO, but she's moving into different territory. How do you feel that she will be able to succeed in the direction that she's trying to go? There are a lot of contradictions we were talking about, and you can't tell exactly what's going to happen, but what's your sense of the direction of what's happening in politics and in the economy generally in Mexico?
Yeah, I think that overall, Claudia will have an easier time than AMLO did, because AMLO was able to shut up and shut out the opposition. AMLO wielded power from the presidency very well. And since his election, the right-wing opposition has been disorganized and without a clear plan or a clear leadership. So AMLO's presidency, a lot of energy was spent combating the attacks of the opposition, whether it was in government bodies like the Congress or the courts or in the media. AMLO has proved a lot of what he said he was going to do, except for things like safety and organized crime and cartel violence. That still plagues Mexico. And so that is going to be part of the homework for Claudia Sheinbaum to really focus on. But for the most part, AMLO maintained Mexico outside of economic crises, right? AMLO's finances were basically, he introduced a set of austerity policies so that the state wasn't spending lavishly on luxury, and that instead the state was more frugal, reducing costs. And so in many ways, Sheinbaum has the larger possibilities of success, as I mentioned, because of the macroeconomic issues between the U.S.-China rivalry. Mexico is placing itself as a successful, friendly environment for investment, whether it is European, Asian, or American, North American manufacturing and technology. So I think she's going to have an easier time consolidating this new transition. And she's going to also have to deliver results. But in many ways, I think that AMLO has already delivered some of those results broadly. My point of view, though, is that social movements is where real deep social change comes from. And so people should continue to organize and demand what they deserve. I think that a lot of what the current government has done is better in comparison to previous governments, but I also think that people deserve better. Mexicans deserve higher wages. Compared to other OECD countries, Mexico's wages are the lowest.
Let's do this, Hector. We're sort of running out of our Zoom time here. Let's put that off until another time. I think it's a fascinating story and a very important one. And possibly what we can get into at that point is these independent organizations, the labor movement, the feminist movement, the indigenous movement, the various movements inside of Mexico, and what they're going through, what their problems are. And we'll see then exactly what the possibilities are for the future. I'd like to thank you for your presentation today, and thank you again for your article. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wayne. It's great to be here.
¿A dónde van los trenes pasajeros? ¿A dónde van palomas del oriente? ¿A dónde irán los cantos más dolientes? Van a llorarle a un hombre guerrillero, el más bragado, más cabal y más valiente. En todas partes la gente levantaba, allá en Chihuahua, Parral y La Boquilla, no más de verlo el gobierno se espantaba y se nombraba el general Francisco Villa, allá en Chihuahua, Parral y La Boquilla. Ni falta que hace que ahora los potentados pongan su nombre con letras amarillas. Su corazón el pueblo le ha entregado desde que andaba combatiendo en la guerrilla, allá en Chihuahua, Parral y La Boquilla. Al ver el campo tan triste y solitario, donde se muere sin agua la semilla, los campesinos le rezan novenarios cuando les faltan el frijol y la tortilla. Qué falta que hace que reviva Pancho Villa, qué falta que hace que reviva Pancho Villa.
That was Corrido de Pancho Villa, sung by Amparo Ochoa. She was a Mexican singer of songs of struggle and solidarity who died much too young in 1994 at the age of 42. It's provided here on Creative Commons license, and you can find this song and many others on YouTube. And again, you can find Hector Rivera's article at the website tempestmag.org. If you found the conversation interesting, pass it on to a friend. I'd appreciate it, and I'm Wayne Heimbach.